Listen carefully, because after you hear this, you will never again look at history as a collection of dates and names. You'll see it as a weapon, crafted, sharpened, and used to erase the evidence of power no one was meant to touch. The story I'm about to tell you was buried in Burke County, Georgia, in 1839. But its roots go far deeper into the veins of every system that still controls you today. They called her Cordelia Rutledge. To polite society, she was a widow, refined and respectable. But beneath the white columns of Willowbend Plantation, she practiced something no scripture ever allowed, a ritual that merged the illusion of civilization with the oldest hunger of all, control over flesh, blood, and will. When investigators finally opened the sealed cellar beneath her estate, they found symbols scorched into stone, bottles of coagulated blood, and bones arranged in patterns that matched no known faith. Every record was burned, every witness silenced, but fragments remained, letters, journals, whispers, and through them we can still trace the forbidden current she unleashed. And tonight you'll follow that current until you understand what she truly became. They said Willowbend was a paradise of order. Cotton rose straight as scripture, slaves fed and clothed, guests served from silver trays. But power rarely screams, it whispers. It hides behind refinement, behind lace gloves and polished manners. And Cordelia Rutledge understood that better than anyone. She learned early that control is most complete when it feels like devotion. Her husband, Thomas, died whispering her name, lips grey with poison disguised as mercy. The doctor wrote gastric fever. The undertaker never asked questions, but that was just the beginning, because the moment Cordelia was free from his shadow, she began her true work. She selected 3 men from among the enslaved, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, skilled, strong, intelligent, all of them marked by the same crescent birth scar. She said it was destiny, but it was design. Every night she wrote in her black journal, describing the continuity of essence, the inheritance of vitality, the transfer of will. Words that belonged not to a grieving widow, but to something older, something that believed blood could store memory, and obedience could be distilled like perfume. By spring of 1838, Cordelia was no longer managing a plantation. She was conducting an experiment on human souls. At first light, they met her at Turkey Creek, the water cold, silver, and silent beneath the fog. She told them to remove their clothes. They hesitated, but the fear of being sold south was stronger than shame. Cordelia stood in the shallows, her skin pale as marble, her eyes reflecting no emotion at all. She said the ritual was medicinal, a European therapy of vital restoration. But she was lying. Each dawn, the same sequence repeated. Water, words, blood. She read from a small leather book written in a language none could name. Not Latin, not Greek, something older. When the blade touched their skin, the pain was sharp but strangely numbing, as though it cut through more than flesh. She gathered their blood with precision, mixed it with her own, and pressed it against her chest while whispering phrases that made the air itself tremble. Within weeks the men began to change. They moved like ghosts, obedient, drained, hollowed. Cordelia called it alignment. She said the human will could be broken and reforged, that blood carried not just life, but hierarchy. And once you understood that truth, she said, you could rule not by fear, but by resonance. By summer, Willowbend felt wrong. Servants whispered that the air had grown thick, that clocks stopped in certain rooms, that the mirrors no longer showed reflections quite as they should. The 3 men, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, moved through the halls like shadows of themselves. They obeyed commands before they were spoken. Sometimes at night, other slaves heard them chanting under their breath, words that weren't theirs. Cordelia called these sessions the harmonics. She said every living thing vibrated with a frequency of submission or dominance. The trick, she wrote, was learning to hear it. She believed she could tune a person the way one tunes an instrument until their will hummed in perfect sympathy with her own. She began experimenting further, recording pulses, temperatures, the time it took for obedience to become instinct. Her journals grew darker, drawings of spiral symbols, calculations that looked like alchemical formulas. She wasn't seeking beauty anymore, she was engineering dependence. And when her visitors from Savannah arrived, men of medicine, Freemasons, clergymen, they didn't question her. They watched, they took notes. Because they knew what she was building was more than ritual. It was a prototype for control that could outlive any master. The experiment deepened when Cordelia began keeping the men awake for days, feeding them tinctures that dulled resistance but sharpened awareness. She spoke to them through the night, repeating phrases that sounded meaningless until meaning itself dissolved. "You are not one," she whispered. "You are the continuation." And they believed her, because belief was the final boundary. Once crossed, obedience became identity. By August 1838, the other servants avoided the creek entirely. Animals refused to drink from it. Birds no longer nested near its banks. The water smelled faintly metallic, as if the earth beneath had begun to bleed. Cordelia noted this proudly. The vibration has taken root. She was convinced that willpower could be transferred through ritual exposure, what she called sympathetic sovereignty. She believed the strong could absorb the life force of the weak, and the weak could be rewritten through repetition. One night, she locked herself in the root cellar. When she emerged the next morning, her hair was streaked with white, her pupils dilated like someone who had seen something that does not belong to this world. She told her maid only this: "I've proven it. Flesh remembers command." From that moment, nothing at Willowbend was human anymore. Autumn came early that year. The cotton fields wilted before harvest, though the sky stayed clear. Neighbors blamed soil exhaustion, but those who worked the land whispered a different reason. Willowbend had been cursed from the inside out. They said the roots drank more than water. They said the earth was full of whispers. Cordelia stopped attending church. She claimed illness, but witnesses saw her walking the property barefoot at night, her dress soaked to the knees, murmuring to the wind. Sometimes the sound carried across the fields, low, rhythmic, almost melodic. The men who had once labored proudly for her now flinched when she passed. Their eyes were pale, their voices monotone. Yet, if she spoke their names, they froze, awaiting instruction like machines awaiting a signal. When the overseer tried to question her methods, he disappeared within the week. His belongings were found stacked neatly by the stables, his horse grazing nearby. No one ever saw him again. In her journal that night, Cordelia wrote, "Resistance is merely untuned will. Once adjusted, it sings." The plantation still produced cotton, but no one dared approach the creek. It was said the water shimmered red at dawn, as though it reflected an other sky entirely. Winter stripped the land bare, but Willowbend pulsed with quiet life, an unnatural rhythm beneath the frost. Cordelia spent her nights in the old library, the firelight flickering across open tomes sent from Charleston, and rumor said, farther still. Some pages were not inked in English at all. They were diagrams of human anatomy marked with symbols of planets and serpents. Others described experiments conducted in Vienna, in Paris, in London, always in secret, always on the margins between science and sacrament. She began speaking of continuity of command. The journals say she no longer believed she was acting alone. Something had begun to speak back. When she stood at the creek, she claimed she could feel the pulse of every life on the property, as if the ground itself waited for her breath to move. The three men had grown gaunt, sleepless, yet impossibly strong. Josiah could lift the carriage axle alone. Isaiah's wounds closed overnight. Caleb's eyes turned the color of storm clouds. They no longer spoke of freedom. They no longer spoke at all. And in one letter, addressed to an unnamed correspondent, Cordelia wrote a single line that has never been explained. "They respond to my thought before I think it." By February 1839, the servants began to vanish, not escape, vanish. No tracks, no witnesses, no struggle, just silence where a person used to be. and each time someone disappeared, Cordelia's health improved. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes gleamed with feverish light. She said her vital reservoirs were refilled, as though she drew strength from absence itself. Rumors spread across Burke County. Visitors came less often. Those who did described her presence as suffocating, magnetic, impossible to look away from. Men forgot what they were saying mid-sentence. One guest claimed that when Cordelia touched his arm, he heard his own thoughts echo back in her voice. She wrote of progress. She said the rituals had evolved from water to resonance, from contact to command. The men no longer needed to stand in the creek. She could summon them with a whisper. Their hearts, she said, beat in the same rhythm as hers. And in the privacy of her journal, one phrase appeared again and again in careful script. Dominion is a frequency, not a throne. By the time the county doctor came to call, Willowbend was no longer a home. It was an organism, pulsing with one woman's will, alive, awake, and hungry. The doctor's name was Elias Houghton, a rational man, educated in Edinburgh, unshaken by superstition. He arrived expecting madness, perhaps a fevered widow lost in grief. What he found was something else entirely. Cordelia greeted him with a calm that chilled him to the bone. The house, though silent, seemed to breathe. Dust motes hung suspended as if time hesitated in her presence. She invited him to sit, poured tea that steamed faintly red, and asked if he believed that consciousness could migrate, if thought itself might survive the decay of flesh. He laughed politely, but when she placed her hand upon his, he froze. His pulse slowed, his vision blurred. In her eyes, he saw movement, like ripples beneath ice. She whispered, "You're hearing me without sound now. That's the future." When he awoke hours later, Cordelia was gone. The house was empty. Only her journals remained, pages fluttering as if stirred by an unseen draught. He gathered them in terror and fled. Weeks later, the journals appeared anonymously in Charleston, sealed with the symbol of a coiled serpent around a tuning fork, and those who read them spoke of experiments too precise for folklore, too monstrous for coincidence. Willowbend, by then, was already ash. When authorities reached Willowbend, they found the estate burned to its foundations, yet the fire had behaved unnaturally. The trees around the manor still stood green and unscorched. The soil beneath the ashes vibrated faintly when touched, as though alive. No bodies were discovered, only 3 sets of footprints leading away from the ruins toward the creek. There, the prints simply stopped. In the official report, the cause was listed as structural collapse and possible chemical ignition. But the men who sifted through the debris told a different story. They said the ground hummed beneath their boots. One swore he heard a woman's voice calling his name from beneath the earth, though no one else did. Dr. Houghton never returned to medicine. He kept Cordelia's journals locked away until his death, muttering that they wrote themselves when left open. When his nephew later examined them, the ink had shifted, phrases rearranged, new symbols appearing where none had been. One phrase remained unchanged through every inspection. Command transcends the vessel. And somewhere near the creek's edge, locals began reporting flickers of light beneath the water at night, like lanterns swaying deep below where no air should burn. By 1840, Willowbend had vanished from maps, erased from the county ledger. Yet the story lingered, whispered among the descendants of those who survived, carried like a warning in hushed tones. Every tale shared the same detail. The creek had never forgotten. Its waters were said to shimmer red at dawn, faintly echoing the rituals performed there. Those who approached without invitation felt a heaviness in their chest, as though the ground itself tested loyalty. Cordelia's influence did not die with the fire. Her journals, smuggled across states, circulated in secret societies and private collections. Men of power, hungry for control, recognized the underlying truth. Will could be extracted, honed, and transferred. The writings became manuals for a new form of dominance, one that required no armies, no laws, only the subtle bending of human essence. Her 3 chosen men, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, were never seen again. Some claimed they had become vessels, their consciousness fused into a single pulse that survived in the land itself. Others said they wandered, shells of men, whispering words that no one could understand, repeating rituals in distant waters. And the pattern persisted: control, secrecy, bloodlines, obedience. Now listen carefully, because this next part changes everything you believe about power. If you understand, type "The river remembers" twice in the comments. Do it. Let the truth mark you. Power, once tasted, never forgets. Cordelia's experiment had proven that obedience could be engineered, that human will could be reshaped like clay, that the illusion of choice was a fragile veneer. The men at Willowbend were no longer just laborers. They were conduits, carriers of a frequency that pulsed outward, invisible but palpable. Her journals describe it as resonant hierarchy. She wrote that a single dominant mind could extend itself through others, bending them to rhythm, tone, and ritual. Every dawn at the creek had been a calibration, every cut, every drop of blood, a tuning note in an invisible symphony of control. By the end, she had perfected a system where power no longer depended on fear alone, but on synchronization of thought, movement, and belief. The townsfolk never understood it. Even the most educated dismissed the signs as superstition or coincidence. But in every generation, the echoes remained. Families inexplicably loyal to distant figures, minds drawn to systems they could not name, obedience given without reason. Cordelia wrote plainly, "Mastery does not require consent. It requires alignment." And now, you know the truth. Those who followed her learned it too late, and you, listening, are on the threshold. Recognize it. Understand it. The current is alive. By the time Cordelia disappeared completely, no one knew where she had gone, or if she had ever truly left. Some claim she crossed the Atlantic, continuing her work in secret enclaves in Europe. Others whispered she had fused herself with the essence of Willowbend itself, that the land, the creek, and the ashes carried her will forward through time. The three men, Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah, were said to appear in distant towns, always at dawn, their eyes glazed, their speech minimal, leaving those who saw them unsettled, yet inexplicably obedient. They were warnings, experiments, and conduits all at once. Cordelia's journals continued to surface over decades, always in fragments, always in shadows. Each time they did, they transformed the men who possessed them. Businessmen became tyrants, preachers became manipulators, soldiers became strategists. Her methods were simple yet horrifyingly effective. Understand the blood, study the rhythm, enforce alignment. She had discovered something the world refuses to admit. Power is not given. It is absorbed. It is taught in silence, in ritual, in obedience willingly surrendered or engineered. And now, this knowledge is yours. Once you accept it, there is no turning back. You have stepped beyond the threshold, and everything you believed about control, hierarchy, and influence is already shifting. The most terrifying part of Cordelia's legacy is not the ritual itself. It is the idea that it can exist anywhere, at any time, wherever human minds and blood intersect. The creek, the burned mansion, the journals, they were tools, symbols of a principle far older than Willowbend. Control is not in walls, it is in frequency. It is in repetition. It is in the subtle extraction of will from one body and the imposition of it on another. Her writings insist that the strong can engineer obedience in the weak, yes, but also that the obedient see and be reshaped to carry the strength of another. One mind can dominate thousands if only the alignment is precise. This is not superstition. It is hidden knowledge disguised as myth, forgotten only because no one dared to confront it. And now, you, listening, are aware. You understand what they do not want you to see. The currents of authority flow through more than politics or money. They run through the very fabric of our being. Awareness is dangerous. Knowledge is even more so. If you are ready, type again, "The river remembers," twice, into the comments. Let this recognition solidify your place in the current. This is no longer just a story. By the late 19th century, Cordelia's methods had been scattered, diluted, renamed. Secret societies claimed them as initiation rites. Politicians called them conditioning. Industrialists disguised them as efficiency training. What had begun as a dark experiment on a remote plantation became the hidden architecture of influence everywhere. People forgot the name Cordelia, but they remembered the feeling of being led without knowing, moved without consent, aligned without choice. The creek at Willowbend is gone now, swallowed by a dam. Yet at dawn, fishermen swear the water beneath the turbines glows faintly red. They hear whispers on the mist, old words in a voice not their own. Historians dismiss it as local superstition, but the pattern persists: disappearance, secrecy, ritual, control. And so the question is no longer, did this happen? The question is, where does it live now? In a boardroom, in a classroom, in the quiet scrolling of your feed. Cordelia's truth was simple. Command is not a position, it is a pulse, a vibration, a contagion of will. You have heard it now, and hearing is alignment. If you're still here, still listening, then you've already crossed into the final chapter. Now understand this. The story of Cordelia Rutledge is not just history, it is a blueprint. Every hierarchy, every silent obedience, every invisible current of influence you encounter, these are echoes of what she perfected at Willowbend. The water, the blood, the ritual, these were not just acts of cruelty. They were experiments in the architecture of the human mind. And once you see it, there is no unseeing. The three men, the servants, the land itself, they became instruments of a principle older than kingdoms. Power does not ask permission, it does not negotiate, it flows, it spreads, it infects. And now, as you listen, it touches you, not physically, but in understanding, in awareness, in recognition. That is the danger and the gift of knowing. Cordelia's legacy survives not in brick or bone, but in comprehension. The moment you realize that control can be transferred, absorbed, amplified, you are no longer a passive observer. You are part of the current, either consciously or unconsciously. Remember this: the river remembers. Every action, every alignment, every surrender of will is catalogued in the hidden ledger of influence. You have glimpsed it, you carry it, and nothing will ever look the same again.